Well, Dr. Tobias Feakin is a global counter-terrorism expert from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He joins me now live from Canberra. Thank you for joining us. Now, this was a soft target, and of course the timing came after the Euro 2016 tournament. That had everyone on alert. So what's your reaction to this, and are you surprised by it?
I mean, reaction to any event like this is always one of complete dismay that you know, so many innocent people are being killed for whatever the cause is of this individual or group who have actually attacked. In terms of pulling apart what we know, what we don't know, at the moment we don't know if this is an individual acting by themselves. Is it someone who is connected to a broader cell network? That's something that the authorities will be filtering through rapidly at the moment to try and understand, is the threat contained? Has now that this individual committed his act and died, does that mean now that the threat has diminished? So they will be now rifling through any evidential chain that they can find to understand, is there a broader network? They'll also be trying to understand who this individual was and what their motivations might be. There have been nascent reports from the French press agency that it's an individual of French-Tunisian descent who actually had lived in Nice. Now, that's unconfirmed, so obviously we'll need that to come from official sources to completely confirm. But what that would allude to is a problem that France unfortunately does have, which is a homegrown terrorist threat of quite a large proportion in comparison to other European states. We know that at least 1,200 French nationals have fought in Syria and Iraq. We know at least 250 of those have returned back into France that we know of. One of the primary measures that Hollande mentioned in his speech was about strengthening border security, and that's clearly been a pinch issue both for Hollande and for other European nations in light of attacks in Paris and Brussels, is trying to get a greater understanding of the through flow of traffic. And if we think where Nice is situated, it's situated near to borders, be they in Spain, sea borders with the north of Africa. So the flow of people, arms is fairly fluid. So he clearly wants to address that. But what we have is just an enormous tragedy which is recurring currently in Europe. And it is unfortunate to say, but it's something that certain groups such as ISIS are clearly targeting. They want to create this collapsing, if you like, of European sense of security, of collective security within the EU. And so they will continue to target France, Germany, other parts of Europe. Does it necessarily mean that we should be stopping travelling to these places and being scared of our everyday movements? No, absolutely not. But there is clearly an intent from groups such as ISIS to create that fear within us.
And Dr. Feakin, I mean, there has been no claim of responsibility for this as yet. If it was directly organised by a group such as ISIS, would you have expected it by now?
Well, I guess the questions would be asked around the fact that France has just hosted the European Football Championships, as you mentioned. They had many millions of new people, if you like, of tourists coming in and out of the country at that point. So it would have seemed like a prime target. But in that sense, it's also a very difficult target to hit because security was so heightened around that particular event that maybe there was a sense of France breathing, if you like, at the end of that European Championships and the opportunity being seen there. As for whether personally I could have predicted this, no, of course not, in terms of the timing. But something we have seen, if indeed it's attributed to a group like ISIS, is the fact that they have become more focused on creating attacks around significant times and dates. The recent spate of attacks during the period of Ramadan is one example of that, and attacking French nationals during Bastille Day, as your reporters have mentioned, it's clearly meant to have an increased significance and an increased impact on the psyche of French nationals.
Yeah, so I mean the fact that that didn't happen in the capital in this case, it was a tourist city celebrating Bastille Day, this is what you're saying could be a sign of what's to come. More soft, unsuspecting targets.
Well, I mean, that's, again, something we've seen, even if you go back through Al-Qaeda's Inspire magazine in 2010, there was an article talking about the use of vehicles to mow people down. They used the analogy of a lawnmower. And al-Adnani, the spokesperson for ISIS in 2014, had also, when he targeted and mentioned Australia and France, had named specifically the use of vehicles in this sort of attack. So, you know, the intent has been there for a long time, but what we're seeing with these groups now is that they are choosing to use a whole range, a whole gamut of tactics and methodologies which create problems for the agencies responding, because, you know, now they have to be right all of the time, and there's no doubting that France's security agencies are under an extreme amount of pressure with the number of individuals who are becoming involved in these kinds of groups.
And, I mean, what sort of questions do you imagine that France is asking itself after an attack like this? And I mean at the official level.
At the official level, I think the first question is what has happened, who perpetrated it, what were their motivations. Then there would be a lessons learned process as well ongoing, whilst, and as we heard from Hollande immediately in 9 o'clock in French time, he will be chairing a session of the Security and Defence Committee to again review what can we do to heighten security and increase the safety of our citizens inside France. So it's essentially, whilst conducting the operation of forensic evidential chain and understanding what's gone on, why, and is that threat contained, it's also understanding, well, what might have gone wrong that we can address immediately, what can we do? And the other side to this, which Hollande was very clear about, was the fact that if indeed whoever conducted this attack thought that they were going to impact in any way French airstrikes and operations in Mali and Syria and Iraq, they're very much mistaken, and he spoke very clearly about the French resolve that it will be France that emerges from this stronger than any terrorist grouping.
And it's the second terrorist attack in a year period. Why France? I mean, obviously they have that involvement, but surely the US would be a bigger target. Is it just harder to get to?
I think, yes, that's part of it. The US is a harder target to get to. With France, let's talk about significant reasons why it could be. They have chosen to take a very prominent military role in combating Islamist extremist groups wherever they might be. You saw that in their engagement in Mali, in getting rid of AQIM and various other Tuareg groups in Mali. They're engaged in Western Africa, they're engaged in Central Africa, fighting Islamist groups there. They're also engaged in Iraq and Syria, so they have deployments of over 10,000 personnel globally fighting Islamist groups, and that's a very significant commitment. They're being very vocal about that at the political strategic level, about their strength of resolve against these groups. They also have a significant homegrown radicalisation issue, as I mentioned earlier. All of this brews to create a problem for them internally, in the sense that they are now being targeted by spokespeople from Islamist groups as a significant target. Now that's facilitated by the fact that France is in mainland Europe, the fact that the flow of weaponry through from the fallout of Libya, which is another conflict that France was involved in, and also the Balkans, which have been a real hub of high-grade weaponry that flows into Europe, and also that ease of access via borders into France makes it, as you rightly suggested, a somewhat easier target to hit than the United States. But we've also seen in recent months how the US has been hit as well. So at the moment, clearly there's a very direct targeting mission that ISIS and associated groups are on to motivate individuals or groups of people within these countries to strike in at their hearts. And, you know, I mean, it's clearly leaving a large imprint on French nationals, and it is really deeply sad to see France suffer in this way.
And I mean, Australia is and has been involved in overseas conflict. Now, there has been cases of homegrown terror threats here, and of course, our borders, like the US, even more so, are harder to get through. But of course, there is a threat here as well, although we've seen many potential attacks foiled.
That's true. The security agencies have been very successful at thwarting attempted attacks or the attacks that were due to take place, arresting individuals involved in those particular groups, but there are still those who have slipped through the net. There are still quite a large number of individuals who are being looked at by agencies, and this puts a stress on their resourcing. It puts a stress on societal relationships between the agencies trying to do their jobs and those who might feel in some way that they're being looked at without due reason, but it's a difficult tension to be able to actually balance. So Australia, yes, it has problems with terrorism, but there are mitigating factors there, which weaponry of the grade that has been used in Paris, for example, is easier to get hold of. Here, yes, we're dealing with a truck that was driven for a group of people, which is, concerning, because again it's another, if you like, morphing in what we're seeing in terms of where the threat is moving. But on the whole, Australia has been very, very good at arresting those who are involved in some way. So proportionately the problem isn't as large. That's not to mean that it isn't significant, and it also means that all the agencies here will also be assessing the threat as they see it within Australia, and making sure that they're geared up and ready, God forbid, for these kinds of attacks.
And I mean, the internet chatter that's monitored by counter-terrorism groups, or agencies, I should say, how difficult is it to distinguish between serious chatter that will amount to something and just simply chatter?
Well, I mean that's really a question for the agencies themselves. Needless to say, it's yes, it's a very difficult job to distinguish between those who are flirting with the ideology, the nascent stages of engaging with dangerous individuals, and those who are highly motivated. What we do know is that the initial stages of interaction between those who are interested in the ideology of ISIS or other groups tend to make those connections in areas of the internet which are fairly easy to monitor, but then very quickly take those conversations into encrypted applications and encrypted chat spaces, which then create a far more acute difficulty for the agencies to be able to monitor and track and trace. And that presently is a very clear discussion in light of the encryption debate that we've just seen occur in the US between Apple and the FBI about access to encrypted communications. And I think that's part of the discussion that you'll see emerge increasingly in the Australian context over the coming year. There is no doubt that the current situation is very difficult to filter through those who are flirting with the ideology and those who are actually becoming seriously embedded with those that want to facilitate their movement from Australia into Syria and Iraq to fight with ISIS.
And I mean, just days ago, France's most senior security officer had warned about planned car bomb attacks, which is not what we saw in Nice, but nonetheless, I mean, this was even perhaps a more simple method than that. Is this the direction where you see terrorist attacks could be going? A simple attack that gets unsuspecting people, of course, and hitting civilians.
I think there's been no secret from from Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and their Inspire magazine, from Al Adnani, the spokesman for ISIS. That's clearly what they want to motivate: are random attacks via methods which aren't involving heavily networked, organised groups on the whole, because they're harder to track and trace. It's really by any means necessary. That's what we're seeing now. It's not so much about the quality. Al Qaeda had a very high bar of individuals that they wanted to allow to join their group with ISIS. That doesn't matter. They want to inspire and allow as many as possible to engage in terrorist activity. So it's by any means necessary. But what we do understand is that terrorist modus operandi morphs and shapes according to the way that security responses are put in place. The example being at airports. You'd seen Richard Reed, the fabled attempted shoe bomber in 2002. Because of him, we ended up having to take our shoes off at airports. So where did the terrorists go after that? They then began to look at the idea of using liquid bombs on aircraft. Then after that, you saw that they tried to use TATP hidden on the person. So they look and study security responses and trying to then morph their attack style to circumvent that particular that security measure that's put in place. So in many respects, it's a game of cat and mouse, and it's one where the pressure is always on the security agencies trying to deal with it, to be able to, if you like, preempt what might come next. It's an incredibly hard equation to balance for the security agencies involved.
And how big an issue in France is the growth of far-right groups and far-right extremist groups even?
For me, probably the more worrying part of this is the increasing presence in mainstream politics in France of far-right groups, and Marine Le Pen is the embodiment of that. She has grown in popularity through the local elections last year, showed that she was becoming increasingly popular, and she really jumps on the bandwagon immediately as something like this happens. She uses it to her own ends, and there's no doubting that you've seen actually across Europe the growing presence of these more mainstream politics, far-right groups. That may sound a bit contradictory, but it's far-right groups that, if you like, making themselves more palatable to the general voter. And certainly in France, that's something that we're seeing take place. I mean, I think it's also useful to point out, in terms of the security apparatus of France, they undertook a review post-Paris and post-Charlie Hebdo attacks in 2015 to try and assess how appropriate their agencies were for responding to this threat, and the actual findings of that report were heavily criticised. But it said that there were failings in French intelligence, and it's always easy to point a finger and say there are intelligence failures, but clearly additional resourcing is required for those agencies to deal with the level of threat they have. But there's no doubt, returning to your original question, that there is a growth in far-right groups in Europe, and that is clearly something that groups like ISIS thrive on and want to promote. ISIS talk a lot about the grey space, how they want to create divisions within European societies between Muslims, and that's clearly their constant theme. And this is something that they will continue to promote. So I think we can certainly expect to see the continual drip feed of far-right propaganda becoming more and more mainstream in European politics, and that's deeply concerning, because it then has quite severe impacts on the whole European Union project and the broader European multicultural society that exists there now.
Dr. Tobias Feakin, global counter-terrorism expert from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, thank you so much for your insights this afternoon.
Thank you.